Today, I'm joined by Dr. Stephanie Bugden. She is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Winnipeg, where she studies cultural and neurobiological influences on children's math learning. Stephanie, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you, Adam. I'm so glad to be here.
We might as well just dive right in, talking about individual differences in math ability. The big question, which is obviously a false dilemma, nature or nurture. Are there genetic components that make some kids better at math than others, or is it all early learning and just getting the right type of exposure?
Yeah, so that is absolutely a sort of important and really a question that everyone in the field really is asking. What are the genetic and environmental influences on math learning? And like most of the nature versus nurture debate, it's a bit of both, right? So there are some research studies that show that individual differences in math is associated with genetics, so with heritability estimates. There is a lot of variability in terms of those findings. And there's also a lot of research that suggests that children who grow up in very enriched numerical environments, who receive lots of activities in the home prior to math learning, tend to be more successful when they start school. Absolutely.
Are those studies on the types of enrichment available in the home? Are those intervention studies where you have a control group and you can be pretty confident that it is, in fact, the intervention? Because if you don't have that, it could get even more genetically confounded, where it's, those studies about if there are more books in the home, then children will grow up
Yes.
to be better readers, but maybe there are more books because the parents are readers and there's like a genetic influence there.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good question. I know that there is some work that's ongoing about math interventions in the home environment. It's definitely not something that I focus on in my research program, so I can't think of those studies off the top of my head. I know I have a colleague here at the University of Winnipeg that's has some ongoing work looking at randomized control trial where she gives numerical strategies as well as literacy strategies to parents to see whether if we if parents focus on those numerical activities, can we provide that causal evidence that the home enrichment is what's leading to positive outcomes? I believe there is some other work that shows that indeed, if you do causally manipulate the home environment, that there are some positive outcomes. I'm less familiar with the details of those particular studies, but I know that there's a lot of ongoing work to explore those causal relationships. And absolutely, you're right. There could be some genetic confounds as well, where those families that tend to be better at math have the genetic influences that end up leading to doing more of those mathematical activities in the home.
Recently, I did an episode with Paul Bloom, and we were talking about the evolution of language. Way back in the 90s, he wrote a paper with Steven Pinker called Natural Language and Natural Selection, and they were arguing for a natural selectionist account of how language evolved in humans. And for a while, I wasn't understanding what the whole point of that was, like it could be any other way. And it wasn't until he used math as a comparison that I really understood what the cultural evolution side was, because language seems clearly adaptive and clearly evolved. But then when you think of math seems to be something more like a byproduct of language or of our capacity for abstract reasoning. And it can be useful in a limited sense. And there's research in hunter-gatherers and maybe even other species. And like a lot of intelligent animals can have counting and maybe even basic arithmetic. But if you're talking about something like calculus, you clearly can't say we evolved to do calculus.
So what you're saying is that there are some numerical capacities that we share across different species, right? So early counting abilities. We do share our ability to approximate between different quantities, right? Animals and various different animal species and even newborn infants can discriminate between large sets of quantities in very similar ways that educated adults can. But indeed, we do have a symbolic system, very much our written language that is human specific, that we acquire with direct instruction and learning.
And how can you tell which types of those functions are something like innate or evolved? I'm imagining looking at the developmental timeline, like maybe kids could figure out something like counting, or maybe even they're like just intuitively an approximation of this has more than this, and talked with some researchers like Nadia Cherniak about not only that intuitive numerical sense, but how it contributes to children's sense of fairness. Once you can quantify things, oh, he got more candy
Mm,
than me. That's unfair. It unlocks a whole new way of looking at the world, so to speak. But then there are other types of math that children probably would have no way of discovering unless they were taught in a very specific.
absolutely. You could even think about our Arabic numeral system. There's nothing, at least our English Arabic numerals, there's nothing intuitive about those symbols. Children need that direct instruction in order to make those links between what those numbers are and then what they need. There's work that suggests that it's possible that our intuitive number sense might play a role in being able to map those symbolic numerals onto those respective quantities. David Barner has some work that suggests that that mostly comes from our language system for which that we're able to build those connections. That requires direct instruction, which then facilitates children's ability to add and manipulate those written numerals in elementary school math class.
Do children generally develop on their math ability on the same timeline? So let's say if someone is advanced, they're still following pretty much the same normal developmental trajectory. It's just they might be at the 5-year-old's ability level where when they're 4, so they're advanced by a year. Does that make sense?
There's a lot of variability in the development of a number of mathematical abilities. There's a wide range for which children are even able to acquire their symbolic number system and be able to use them flexibly. We see a lot of individual differences even within the early grades. Children between first, second, third grade show a lot of variability in being able to discriminate between the two written numbers or even two quantities. And there are some children that really struggle to grasp fundamental math concepts. So there are children that struggle for multiple different reasons, whether it's because they didn't necessarily have that enrichment in the home prior to starting school. And so they have that little bit of a delay. And so it's harder for them to reach the same skill set as their peers that come from more enriched homes. There are also kids that struggle because they might have a learning disability, for example. So there's a lot of variability in the timeline for which we see children develop basic number skills as well as more advanced math skills.
I do puberty research, and this isn't the best parallel, but it's the first example that comes to mind. So there's a ton of variability in pubertal timing and tempo. Some people start earlier and later than others. And for some, the whole thing, you have a giant growth spurt within a matter of a year, and you're pretty much done. And for others, it's much more protracted. So there's a lot of variability there. But nevertheless, if you zoom out far enough, children are following pretty much the same trajectory. So it's like you go through the same Tanner stages and you watch the body develop in very predictable stages. What might not be predictable is the timing, but the stages are predictable. So do you see similar stages like that with mathematical development, even though there's a bunch of variability in the timing and individual abilities?
I my my intuition is that the that math learning is a little bit more of a continuum. That's going to be driven largely by the curriculum, the math curriculum. So there's going to be a lot of variability across different countries, even within countries and different school divisions. For the most part, there is, I guess, sort of a continuum for which skills are built from one another, right? You can't learn to add and subtract without understanding basic number concepts, right? Like 4 is bigger than 3, 4 means more than 3 in order to add them together. Children often need to understand what the whole number system, although there's some interesting work suggesting that they have to now change and think flexibly about numbers when you introduce fractions and fraction arithmetic as well. So there is, in some sense, a continuum or similar. I sort of want to avoid stages because I think it's a little bit different than puberty stages, but there is a continuum for which skills are learned and built from these foundational level capacities. But there's going to be a lot of variability in terms of if you scan out what that looks like across children. And there's going to be a lot of cross-cultural differences across what are learning within schools.
It's funny with puberty, perhaps with the exception of menstruation and when males start producing sperm, the whole thing is continuous. In the Tanner stages,
Mhm.
it's useful
And
research-wise because
arbitrary.
as
Yeah.
you have to make up a way to capture things if you're, like, trying to create a survey and turn this into a Likert scale and just score people, but ultimately, you're creating this artificial score based on a natural biological continuous process, so I can see the parallels there between
And,
trying to capture what's really going on in the brain when you're talking about math learning.
right. And perhaps grades within school are those arbitrary sort of stages that we give kids to account for what they know and what they don't know in math. I would imagine that what a third grader, and I have found this in terms of, moving from Ontario to the US and looking at cross-cultural studies, we do see that there are differences in what kids know when you do those cross-cultural comparisons. And it's likely, or at least one potential factor might be what they're learning in school.
In math, you can always prove the same concept with multiple different ways. And sometimes there's a very symbolic way of doing it, and sometimes you can visualize it. If you're talking about, I don't know, how do you calculate the area of a shape? One way of doing it is like these sort of paper cutouts, and you're moving around the things and you're seeing, oh, actually, if you combine two triangles in this way, they make a rectangle with the same length and width. And that's why you get the 1/2 in this formula. And then I'm sure there's a way of proving that, like, without appealing to actual shapes at all, just doing it
With
symbolically.
formula, exactly.
And you hear about multiple intelligences. You hear about some people are more visual learners. Although I've heard about this as a controversial claim, where's the truth there about whether some people are more visual learners than others, or some strategies work for some people, but not others?
So indeed, there is evidence suggesting that learning styles is indeed a myth. There isn't any strong evidence that there are visual learners and auditory learners and kinesthetic learners. There is work, though, suggesting that if we provide multiple different ways of explanation, that can be that converging inputs, so using visual cues mixed with auditory cues, excuse me, can be more effective in children being able to learn those concepts. There is a lot of individual variability. There are strengths and weaknesses. Some children might grasp a concept faster if presented visually. And there could be a bit of a hierarchy in which you can present, you can present information visually and combine it with the formulas. I'm less familiar with the education work that goes with that I'm less familiar with the education research that might suggest how that information should be presented.
Multiple learning styles in this sense is largely a myth. How about multiple intelligences? For example, in IQ research, one of the major breakdowns is usually you have a verbal IQ and then you have a spatial mathematical IQ. And then to the extent that's true, you would predict that it's people with the higher spatial mathematical IQ that are performing better in math.
Studies have shown that both verbal and visual spatial IQ are associated with mathematical abilities. It's gonna differ based on the math abilities that you're assessing. For example, if you are using something, if you think about the math fluency subtest from the Woodcock-Johnson standardized assessment, it is a bunch of arithmetic problems that individuals have to solve those problems as quickly and accurately as can. You're likely to require retrieving those answers and those facts from memory. Verbal IQ is highly correlated with individual differences in math fluency. It's likely that if you have a different mathematical outcome, potentially something like geometry, you might see the strength of those correlations differ and vary. So both verbal and the visual spatial IQ assessments in a classical IQ test are found to be associated with individual differences in math skills.
Do you see any sex differences in development in either these two forms of IQ or in math ability? I've heard arguments on both
Mhm.
sides. I've heard, for example, related to my research on hormones, that testosterone influences the way the brain processes spatial reasoning. And in adult studies, at least, I've heard some evidence that women tend to be higher in verbal IQ and men tend to be higher in spatial IQ. But then, from what I know about education studies in children, you don't really find any sex differences in grades or in math ability. And if you're talking about why women are underrepresented in STEM, it seems to be more like going into high school and even going into college, they're performing just as well at math. And maybe it's just for other social reasons or interest or something like that, that they're not pursuing those math careers at the same rate. So
Right.
all that's to say, I look at that and can't find any clear story to extract out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. From what I understand on the gender differences, similarities work. We do see that there are consistent findings that men tend to outperform women in spatial cognition like tasks. So the mental rotation task, there is evidence that shows that there's a lot of variability in the evidence between whether we see gender differences in mathematical abilities. However, there are a few published large scale studies that have shown that there are no gender differences in really young children when you explore those differences in early numerical capacities. So things like very basic number tasks in very young kids, we do not see any differences in performance on those tasks.
Is the
Any
theory
difference
there because it's just numerical and it's not spatial, or is the theory because if it's prior to puberty, you're not seeing these hormonal organizational effects on brain development?
My interpretation, and this is based on some of the work by Dr. Aaron Maloney at the University of Ottawa and Dr. Mariah Sokolowski, who's now at Toronto Metropolitan University. They both have shown that any gender differences that we do see in older children and adults can be accounted for by individual differences in mathematical anxiety. So the way in which they feel about math. So their negative emotions that might be associated with having to perform math. And we don't see that earlier in development. One possibility is that this is a cultural phenomenon or some sort of stereotypical, the way in which we think about how men and women should be performing math might be associated with potentially why women don't perform as good as men in math, why they might not necessarily select careers in STEM fields. It's also the case. So Dr. M. Maloney's published now two papers that have suggested that individual differences in teachers' math anxiety is associated with how much their students learn in that academic year. So there could be some underlying ways in which math is taught in schools that might be translated into how their students are learning math that could be facilitating trajectory towards individuals not necessarily performing well in math or choosing to avoid mathematical careers. So I think that they've got very interesting work exploring the mechanisms and the nature behind mathematical anxiety, how that associates to math learning, and whether individuals select or avoid STEM careers. My interpretation is it seems like it's less about there's less about biology and more about environmental or cultural factors that might be influencing why we see maybe gender differences in older individuals, less so in younger kids.
That reminds me of something in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. He talks about how if you look in the Canadian National Hockey League, all of the athletes, or most of the athletes, are born during the same 6-month window of the year, where you would expect that if it's a random sampling, you'd have a roughly 1 in 12 chance for each month. And the reason for that, he says, I don't remember which month is the cutoff, but at some early age, when children are being recruited and they're bracketed by age, the ones who are like at the end of the age cutoff, so who are up to 11 months older than all their peers, are just slightly bigger and stronger and better. And
Yes.
then they get more attention from the coaches, and then they get better and better. And then by the time that snowballs into adulthood, you have all of the professional level athletes are the ones who have that slight initial advantage. So then the parallel I'm seeing here is that even if for entirely separate biological reasons, if women are slightly higher in just generalized anxiety, and some of that gets loaded onto math, then it can have this pernicious snowball effect.
We do see that women have higher math anxiety when you control for generalized anxiety. So this is thought to be a distinct construct. Math anxiety is separate. Of course, there are associations between other anxiety measures, but we do see that there are gender differences in math anxiety where women tend to have higher math anxiety, even when you control for things like generalized anxiety.
Do you know if you see the opposite, males experiencing more anxiety in female dominated fields, like in psychology, for example?
Oh, that's super interesting. I really don't know. I'm less aware of whether that is the case. What are your thoughts about that? Parts of me wonders if that's less so because men maybe tend to be more confident, but
Yeah, so men certainly seem to have lower anxiety on average, but then I'm wondering again, like you mentioned, these studies control for generalized anxiety. So if you control for that
mm,
generally lower level of anxiety in males, would you see something dependent on the sex ratio in the field you're in? Because psychology is 70% female, and developmental psychology, which we're both in, I think is even more skewed towards women. It's 80%. I'm one of the only guys in my lab out of 15. I found it amusing. I haven't found it threatening, but I have thought a lot about if the roles were
yeah,
reversed and you have 2 women and 13 guys, that could make people uncomfortable. So, I don't know.
no, it's absolutely an interesting question. But yeah, I'm not sure of the science behind specifically those scenarios.
Where does the neuroscience come into your research?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in using neuroscience as a tool to understand the cognitive mechanisms that support math learning. So I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about the brain, so individual differences and how we use use our brain, how we engage the brain when performing mathematical tasks. I'm largely focusing on younger children. I'm really interested in children when they first start school. So how does the neurobiological processes support how successful they were going to be when they start school? What are those individual differences in neural functioning when they're processing very basic number concepts like matching number words to quantities? There's some research that suggests that children who start school with they understand that number words represent the total number of items in a set. So they're able to count items and know that if they count six things, it means if they count to six, it means six things. Sorry. And so kids that start off school with that capacity tend to learn math at quicker rates than kids that don't. So I'm interested in understanding what are the individual differences in the neural circuitry associated with acquiring those skills. And I'm really interested in how the brain changes as children acquire those skills in school. So I'm starting the study hopefully this year in kids in preschool children where they're going to come into the lab. We're going to use FNIR. So this is functionally near infrared spectroscopy. So it's like a cap that they can put on their head. It is very difficult to get really young kids to lie in a scanner. So using fMRI can be a really challenging tool for really young kids. And so I hope that we can capture the individual differences in the neural mechanisms associated with processing the meaning of number words and then track that across development. How does that change as children learn more complex math skills in school?
You see the same snowball effect as with hockey, where if young children show a slight advantage, they may get more attention from their teachers, and then the gap between them and their peers only widens over time.
We do see that gap, absolutely. That it's known as the Matthew effect. We also see it in literacy. Children who start school with the really basic foundational capacities needed. So in the field of literacy, that's phonological awareness or processing skills. In numeracy, that's cardinality, so understanding the meaning of numbers. We do see that those kids tend to outperform or that gap widens. They tend to learn at faster rates relative to kids that don't have those skills. I'm less familiar about whether it's because they're attracting more attention from their teachers. It could be that they have these sort of foundational cognitive capacities to learn at a quicker rate, right? Where kids that don't have those skills might be missing critical concepts. They might be just falling farther behind because they don't have those initial skills.
That environmental context seems like it would completely shift the story that you tell based on, let's say, the brain data. So I'm imagining you're looking at individual differences in just the brain data, and you don't know anything about which kids they're coming from and how much attention they're getting from their teacher and so forth. And the story you might tell from that is that the children who are doing better at math are the ones with greater neuroplasticity, and they're just better at learning, and you're assuming they're in the exact same environment, but they're just getting more out of it. But then there's the question of, even if there are individual differences and some kids have that increased neuroplasticity, how do you know if that's something like a quality of the child or if it's a response to getting more individualized attention that promotes that plasticity?
Oh, absolutely. So it's very difficult to tease apart maturational and environmental factors or experiential factors. Very difficult. even if I'm able to, even if I'm able to control for the kid, like what classes kids are in, exact age, because as you say, every individual child has different experiences within a classroom. So I'm not going to be able to tease apart maturational versus experiential processes to the same degree. There is some really eloquent work where I could look at, like, I could match kids based on ability and match kids based on maturational. So, like, on age, and look at whether there are any differences in neural processes as a function of, like, I can look at those differences when matching. But I'm really interested in individual trajectories. So I'm not really interested in comparing kids that show neuroplastic changes and kids that don't. I'm looking at individual differences and how they start school and where that gets them at the end of school. I'm more interested in looking at tracking those individual trajectories and trying to characterize those rather than looking at, say, group differences that are kids that do and don't have the skills, although we're able to look at that as
Mhm.
well. But you're right, I'm not able to perfectly tease apart maturational versus experiential factors. We can do things like ask parents to fill out questionnaires and tell us a little bit about what kinds of things they do in the home. And we could even potentially ask teachers what kinds of things they're doing in the classroom. But as a first step, we're just looking at first individual differences in processing the meaning of those number words and how those individual differences at brain level is associated with behavior and knowledge.
The beginning, we spoke a bit about genetic contributions to IQ and to math ability. Have you had any opportunity to do twin studies or something, some genetically informed design in your research?
I haven't. It's not that I would be absolutely eager to partake in. I don't necessarily have the experience or the background to do genetic type work. Because I'm interested in individual differences and mathematical learning disabilities in particular, why kids might struggle to learn math, it would be interesting to take that route. So I'm open to potential collaborations, but at this point, I'm not looking at genes.
We talked about this math ability being a natural continuum. And when you're talking about disabilities, is that something that's just referring to children at the lower end of the tails and it's really just an arbitrary cutoff? Or are there some types of disabilities that are really a qualitative disability and there's something you can point to that they're lacking?
Absolutely. I think this is an ongoing sort of conversation in special education and the field of neurodevelopmental disabilities and learning disabilities, because there is a little bit of this controversy in terms of the arbitrary cutoffs. There isn't really strong evidence to suggest that there's something completely qualitatively different about kids at the lower end of the tail. So children with mathematical learning disabilities tend to be, yes, at the lower end of the normal distribution, and they tend to show lower performance across a wide range of tasks. So it might suggest that there's something a bit more continuous and that we're just capturing this lower end of the normal distribution. And we as scientists, but also clinicians are creating these arbitrary cutoffs to create sort of a group where we can study so we can understand why they might be struggling, but also for receiving special education services in the classroom or treatment so that we can help intervene or provide those services that children might need to succeed and to flourish.
Another example of a more, I think, qualitatively different type of learning disability would be dyslexia, which if at least if you control for it carefully enough, is independent of verbal ability. So it's just if they might score lower on verbal IQ
Yeah.
if they're just being tested in the same way and you're not aware of that. But it seems to be this qualitative difference. I don't know if dyslexia is only with words and letters or if it applies to numbers too. Is there a mathematical dyslexia?
So mathematical, you might be thinking of dyscalculia. So dyscalculia is a specific mathematical learning disorder that is within the same umbrella as specific learning disorders as dyslexia. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability in reading. Dyscalculia is a specific math learning disability. They're very comparable in the sense that they have the same sort of definitional criteria. So these are children that are underperforming in their respective academic areas. So children that are either below what's expected of their chronological age in terms of reading for dyslexia and math for dyscalculia. There's high co-occurrence between dyslexia and dyscalculia. So roughly 50% of kids that have dyscalculia also have dyslexia. So there is this suggestion that there is an overlap somewhere along the way, whether it is, as you've brought up, some sort of genetic overlap between reading and math, or some of the verbal elements of math and reading that might be associated with why there are kids that have both and why kids only have one or the other.
I'm relying on stereotypes here, but when thinking about how dyslexia is portrayed in the media, it's often something like the child wants to be able to read fluently and it's frustrating and it's a thing that you have to overcome. But then when I think this is the first time I'm hearing about dyscalculia, I'm thinking if I told kids about that, half of them would raise their hands and be like, "Oh, I have that," or "I want to have that." And it
Yeah.
seems to do with this math stigma we were talking about
Yes,
earlier. What do you think is going
absolutely.
on there?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there is this sort of cultural aspect of math and reading. It's okay for us to be bad at math, but no one would ever admit to being bad at reading. If you can't read, it's something you would never admit to, or you might have a little bit more of an embarrassment when it comes to reading. But it's very typical for people just to say that they're not a math person or they're bad at math. And really, anyone could be a math person, right? With the right instruction, with the right tools, everyone can learn math. But there is this sort of cultural element where it seems to be okay or potentially cool to be bad at math, less when it comes to reading. And dyscalculia is less well known. We are far behind in terms of understanding dyscalculia relative to dyslexia. So if we plot the number of research articles that have been published in the field of dyslexia relative to dyscalculia, even by year, there are incredible, incredible differences in terms of how many publications we see are coming out in dyslexia. We are about 20 years behind in terms of understanding the source of mathematical learning disabilities like dyscalculia relative to what we know about dyslexia.
I'm imagining that if these are biological learning disorders that emerge in development, you would see similar levels of dyslexia and dyscalculia across cultures. And that if it's maybe confounded by, because I'm sure that if you're testing for this, the way you would test is that if people are significantly underperforming on the tests, that could just be due to lack of interest or any other more social, cultural
Mhm.
pressure. Do you see similar rates across cultures?
So we do see like epidemiology studies do suggest that there are similar prevalence rates across dyscalculia and dyslexia. In terms of across cultures, there's a lot of variability. I'm less familiar about what the prevalence rates are across the world, but both dyscalculia and dyslexia seem to influence the same proportion of school age children in the classroom. In terms of whether it's a true dyscalculia or whether it's because there's some motivational factors that might have played a role in why children are underperforming, that's a really interesting question. And I think that's really interesting in terms of a scientific or research standpoint, right? And we do see that dyscalculia is very heterogeneous, right? So it's not, there's a lot of variability in children's strengths and weaknesses, even within children who do have dyscalculia. So it's a very hard learning disability to study. And that is likely because of potential environmental factors that could play a role as to why they're underperforming. In my PhD dissertation, I tried to account for that factor by specifically recruiting kids that showed persistent difficulties across time. Okay, so these are kids that are consistently underperforming on standardized tests of achievement over multiple years. Kids that might have only performed bad on 1 year or for one testing session, but performed typically or above the specified threshold would not have been recruited back. And this is in this way, we tried to basically isolate or try to study specifically kids that had dyscalculia in order to try to understand a little bit more about the neurobiological sort of learning disability. But one thing that I find interesting here is, and I think, again, sorry to go back to the research standpoint, that's really interesting because I think understanding the environmental contributions to why children are underperforming versus potentially neurobiological ones might actually play a role in what kinds of interventions might help kids learn math better. The sources of that information, it can be very interesting and very applicable to informing, okay, what skills do we target and how do we teach these kids? Whether kids are underperforming, we just need to basically pick out what kids are underperforming and in what areas are they underperforming and try to provide them that help, whether that's in the classroom or through tutoring.
Rob Henderson, the social psychologist.
I do not, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
He's a social psychologist with a very unique background. He was raised in the foster system and then joined the military and then eventually went to Yale on the GI Bill and started doing research with Paul Bloom and then got his PhD and started popular science writing. He runs a popular Substack. And he talks about how, and he's a very smart guy, obviously, but he talks about how when he was in high school, he was like flunking out and he took the SAT and he got a very poor score. And it obviously, looking back, wasn't due to lack of ability, but it was just either lack of motivation for school or just having other troubles in the home. And he says there's basically one way to do well on these tests. There's lots of ways to fail. And when you fail, it's hard to tell, again, whether this is the lack of ability itself or if there's all sorts of environmental stressors and other confounds that are just making the test not measure what it's supposed to measure properly. And it's hard to get a kid in a lab setting and say, okay, you you have to try to the best of your ability here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of variability in terms of how we assess various different skills and even how they're taught in the school. In the lab, it's actually very challenging when it comes to doing research with young kids because we have very limited time. Kids only have they have a limited attention span. So we try to pick out measures that are best going to get the information that we need or that could best assess the particular skills. However, that's quite challenging. And we do know that there is a lot of variability in in how children are going to perform across those different measures.
We're talking about all these different stressors that can impact one's ability to accurately measure the learning that's going on. And one major stressor that we all just faced over the last several years is COVID. And I've talked with friends and colleagues about this, speculating that it's going to be young children who are hit the hardest because you talk about math, for example, and reading and really everything. They build on themselves. So if you don't get your basic counting and arithmetic done, you're not going to be able to learn the next level thing. So I've been imagining that kids, I don't know, ages 5 to 8 or so, who are that age during COVID were the ones hit the hardest because now they're lacking the skill set that they're going to need to build on what they should have learned during that online learning environment, which probably wasn't as good as when you're in person and paying full attention.
Absolutely. Full disclosure, I definitely have not been studying the effects of COVID on math learning. There is some work that has been coming out, though, that do suggest that there are learning delays because, as you can imagine, with everything shut down, parents needing to work full time while tutoring their children or making sure that they're attending their online classes is quite challenging. And so kids are not necessarily getting the same academic inputs that they would if they were in the classroom learning. And it's really interesting from a developmental standpoint to think about how COVID-19 has impacted all children around the world, right? We international, we had a sort of a global shutdown that is going to influence learning in this capacity. And I'm studying actually that age range for which kids are learning these skills and they might not have necessarily learned them in the same way that pre-COVID would have learned them. So I'm fascinated to see what kind of things come out of my data. although it's not necessarily in a controlled sense. So I wouldn't be able to compare kids that are learning these skills. So if we think about learning the meaning of number words that I discussed earlier, I don't necessarily have a comparison group of kids pre-COVID in order to make these direct comparisons. Although we can speculate that there is going to be some variability in terms of what kinds of inputs kids are getting or has gotten that might influence their learning. And so, yeah, I think, but it is an interesting discussion when we think about how COVID has impacted all the different areas. If you think about social development and language development, it's often a conversation in my developmental psychology class where even students are speculating about their own experiences and how that might be influencing kids' development and at various different ages.
As an educator at the university level, have you noticed any differences in your students pre and post COVID in terms of attention span or work ethic or anything like that?
I so I am a new faculty member, so I've only been teaching for the last 2 years. So I started teaching in the midst of COVID. My first class was online. And so I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask this question because I do not have a pre-COVID experience of teaching at the university level. From what I gather from colleagues and some of the things that I'm observing in the classroom relative to my experiences as a student myself, it does seem like that students are a bit more stressed relative to what I've experienced in the past. They're also starting university after receiving several years of online instruction. So there is this learning curve or this they've had to adapt over the last year or two of basically coming back to in-person learning and being in the classroom. And I think that many students have expressed that to be very challenging, going from an online format in high school and then switching into university. They've missed and even the students who started university in the midst of COVID, who didn't have that experience of coming onto campus their first and second years, feel very disconnected. They didn't get a chance to meet other students who started university at the same time because they were learning at home in their PJs through a Zoom camera. So I think that there is a lot of adapting that students have had to do and try in terms of learning how to be even a student at the university level.
We talked about the Matthew effect earlier, like to those who have, more will be given, to those who have not, everything will be taken. I think that's the biblical line. And I know of a lot of research on COVID and how it's exacerbating existing socioeconomic inequalities, especially in education. So it's like everyone is no longer in the same learning environment and now they're at home learning independently. Okay, but some families are going to really stay on top of their children to make sure that they're trying to get the most out of this online education. And then some, they're working, or maybe they even have spotty internet access. Like you can imagine all sorts of things that just get in the way of
Absolutely.
the child to achieve the same learning outcome as their peers, given these socioeconomic inequalities.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. And I think that's what has been emerging in the field is that we do see that these inequalities are exasperating as a function of your due to COVID-19 because of the limited access that some individuals might have.
Or you would hope that during the pandemic, they got worse. And then since then, they've been getting better. Do you think that's true?
I I would like to think so. Unless I don't know about the data in terms of whether there's anything published to see whether we see we have to wait for the longitudinal studies, I think, to emerge to look at, to track sort of how those changes occur over time as a function of whether it's socioeconomic status, either pre, during, or post COVID, how those learning trajectories have changed.
For children, I'm imagining the effects of SES are even worse. But when I'm thinking about college students, that definitely those same factors come into play. Like some students have to work during the pandemic. And again, like the spotty internet access, or maybe you're at home with family, and that could be a more or less chaotic environment. But then the older you get, the more something like how conscientious you are also seems to come into play. And there are massive individual differences there as well. And when I think about my online learning experience, it was primarily my sophomore and junior year of college. And I actually quite enjoyed it. I feel like I felt like a PhD student because as they just give us a whole bunch of freedom and the classes aren't like your primary focus. Your primary focus is research. So you're doing the classes, but especially online, they felt easier and something you're not investing as heavily into as before. And yet I was still motivated to do a lot of independent study. And I'm actually noticing a lot of parallels between those COVID years and this first year of my PhD. One of my stats classes was online, and I felt like I had the same amount of freedom as I did during COVID. And fortunately, I was putting it to productive use. But I know that I'm on the extreme nerdy end of the spectrum where like my idea of fun right now is doing this podcast and talking to an academic and learning about your research. So that's basically an extension of my schooling. But then if you don't use that extra free time essentially to study more, then it's clear that you could fall behind if the quality
Yes.
of your actual university instruction goes down.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you say that because I have students that either loved the pandemic because they flourish or they thrive on individualized learning, like being able to take the material, read it, study it, and learn on their own and do really well. So I have students on that side of the spectrum who would much rather not come face to face with anyone and just take the material and learn it. And then there's students that feel the complete opposite, that they don't necessarily thrive on that lack of a structure or that face to face time within the classroom for which they can ask their questions or learn with in person. So I did have a student that was really interested about why is that, right? Why is it that there are students that seems more motivated or students that just seem to thrive on being able to work independently or to learn independently and those that tend to enjoy or flourish through in-person learning? I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure the research evidence surrounding those types of questions, but it's interesting that you said how much you liked it because I did have students that also said the exact same thing. They
Mhm.
just would much rather go back to asynchronous video lessons or just reading and studying on their own without having to step foot at the university campus.
I've thought a lot about it, knowing that I'm the anomaly. And that's actually how this podcast got started. There was this cognitive science club during my undergrad where we would have guest speakers, and then that moved online. I was sometimes interviewing or hosting the speaker, and then seemed podcast like, and then that blossomed into this. But I've mainly thought of two explanations for why you the sources of those individual differences. So one is something like personality trait based internal. So it seems to be conscientiousness, what your work ethic is, and then maybe openness, like how curious you are. Because at least if you're in the right area where you are genuinely curious about it, it seems like that can sustain self study. And another this is almost more of a psychoanalytical take on it. It's like children who were more independent or university students who had to be more independent during childhood. So maybe they come from a big family, especially if they were like an older sibling and taking care of younger siblings, that they're more prepped for this type of independent education. And then other
Mm.
kids at the other extreme who like had a lot of help growing up were used to that help and maybe became reliant on it.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, I think that all of those factors can indeed play a role. As you were talking, I was thinking anecdotally about myself, actually, because I would consider myself a pretty independent person. I never really, my academic and educational career, I was the anomaly in my family. In terms of enjoying school and doing it on my own. And I took one online class in university and hated it. I like the social aspect of being in a classroom. I don't know if I don't think it's associated entirely by maybe motivation or independence.
And are you an extrovert?
I am an extrovert, but I feel like I'm switched. I think in the past I would have been a bit more of an extrovert, but I'm wondering if I'm a little bit of both as I get older. I don't know if I don't know much about the personality literature. Can you
But
change
that's
across development?
interesting. You can change, and the 2 changes that usually happen from it, people become less neurotic, more conscientious, and maybe a little bit more extroverted, at least if you're starting out on the introverted side. I haven't heard of extroverts becoming less extroverted with age. There's other research, not really personality focused, of what matters to you starts to change. You start to have this narrower circle of care. So maybe that could manifest as lower extroversion if what you're really doing is saying, I'm going to prioritize family and those closest to me and like quality over quantity type thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what? Now that you say that, I probably am more of an extrovert, and the change of feeling a bit more introvert is just prioritizing sometimes my own time. But I do get a lot of energy in going, in-person meetings, going to classrooms, conferences. So I probably was higher on the extrovert scale, which maybe that's the factor. Less maybe is it the
Yep.
extroversion introversion scale that's associated with why I would feel like learning in the classroom suits me more.
Prior to COVID, I talked with fellow introvert friends about, hey, what is the adaptiveness to us? It seems like we live in an extroverted world, and I, there's sort of these selection pressures for extroversion. And once COVID happened, it seems like we knew our place. That it, in general, the more solitary you were in your day to day life before the pandemic, the less of a major adjustment it was, even though it was a major adjustment for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's cool how this conversation has spun from the individual differences in what you study in children's math learning all the way up to speculation about individual differences in adults' personalities, a wide ranging
Yeah.
conversation. Thank you very much for your time, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun. And to take your words, I'm a nerd too, being able to be on a podcast. It was a lot of fun and talking about research and getting to meet you. So it was a fun way to start my day.
Me too. Thank you.